Peter Bilmer also wrote in on Facebook. Apropos science educators or people who pretend to be one. A creepy YouTube atheist claims that a geological formation known as the Ashley Phosphate Beds is composed of invisible layers, proving deep time. Can you address that claim? Is that because every evidence for evolutionism is in fact invisible and has to be imagined? Well, thanks for writing in, Peter. The Ashley Phosphate Beds are a layer of sediments which are being mined today for its high quantities of phosphate, which is being used for fertilizer. These sedimentary layers are huge, covering large portions of the Carolinas and quite probably extending into Florida and up into Canada. The world-famous geologist Louis Agassiz described the phosphate beds as the greatest graveyard he had ever known. The phosphate beds have so many fossil bones in them that it's believed the phosphate itself is from bones. So, if the Ashley Phosphate Beds are so loaded with such incredible fossils as to cause one of the leading geologists and zoologists of his day to call them the greatest graveyard he had ever known, why then has virtually zero been written about the fossils in the scientific literature? When you look at what was written in the 1800s, you'll probably quickly deduce why. The fossils completely ravage the evolutionary timeline. In that 18-inch thick layer, there has been found together the bones of whales, porpoises, fish, sharks and ray sharks, including the gigantic shark Megalodon, toads, crocodiles, alligators, turtles, rabbits, monkeys, horses, tapirs, camels, elephants, rhinoceroses, mammoths and mastodons, sloths, muskrats, deer, pigs, dogs, sheep, hadrosaur dinosaurs, iguanodon dinosaurs, what are commonly called marine dinosaurs like the plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs, and yes, human bones, teeth, and artifacts. That's right, dinosaurs, mammoths, marine reptiles from the alleged dinosaur period, and humans, all found in the same layer. As many leading evolutionists have acknowledged, if humans and dinosaurs were found together, it would demonstrate that the Earth was young. It would refute the millions of years and would refute evolution. Creation would be vindicated. So how does this atheist answer this powerful evidence, refuting evolution and affirming a young Earth and creation? By claiming that there are layers to the Ashley Phosphate Beds, and that the marine dinosaurs, the mammoths, and the human fossils are actually separated into these individual layers. You just can't see the layers. Invisible layers. Good explanation. This bizarre explanation gets even weirder when you consider the layer average is a whopping 18 inches thick. That's a lot of invisible layers compressed into 1.5 feet of sediments. And this would also mean that the scientists who have studied it were completely blind to these layers, which is ridiculous, seeing as how they'd studied layers elsewhere, and this layer was only 18 inches thick. Professor of Geology and Paleontology, F.S. Holmes, believed in the conventional evolutionary sequence, so he knew full well that humans and dinosaurs should not be found in the same layer. In fact, he wrote, "Not long after finding the above-named relics of human workmanship, and engaged in our usual visits to the Ashley bed, a bone was found projecting from the bluff, immediately in contact with the surface of the stony stratum, the phosphate rocks. We pulled it out, and behold, a human bone. Without hesitation, it was condemned as an accidental occupant of quarters to which it had no right, geologically, and so we threw it into the river. Alas, we have lived to regret our temerity and rashness. A year after, a lower jawbone with teeth was taken from the same bed, and now we have it in the cabinet." In fact, Holmes even portrayed a dinosaur and a human on the cover of his book. The only people claiming invisible layers is creepy internet atheists. Others, like Holmes, have at least tried to explain the way the fossils found together as perhaps fossils that were worked out of older and younger rocks to be washed together. Now, this theory also just plain doesn't work, and I don't have time to get into explaining that today, but it shows you that these experts who spent considerable time excavating in the phosphate beds obviously didn't think there was multiple layers there. contrary to the ignoramuses on YouTube, who obviously don't even know how to use Google to find basic information about the Ashley phosphate beds. You can read more on the Ashley phosphate beds in the book written by the late geologist John Watson, Man, Dinosaurs and Mammals Together, available at the Mount Blanco Fossil Museum. Thanks for writing in, Peter.
Now, we also hear this question, or this assertion, that birds have evolved from dinosaurs, right? So I want to look at that for a bit and examine whether or not that actually makes sense. Now, a lot of it comes from something called homology, and if you look that up in the dictionary, you find out it's defined as likeness in structure between parts of different organisms, as the wing of a bat and a human arm, due to evolutionary differentiation from a corresponding part in a common ancestor. So by definition, when you see common parts, apparently, it's because of evolution. So for example, here's a picture of the human arm and the frog arm, and the bird wing and the seal wing, right? And they all kind of look similar. Apparently, that's because it all turned out from evolution. However, if what they say is true, that it's inherited from a common ancestor, then that must be as a result of inheriting genetic information. That is our DNA. Therefore, we should always expect to see it develop embryonically in a similar manner. It's built into the DNA, right? Or develop from the same embryonic tissue, or develop controlled by the same gene sequence. Turns out none of these are actually true. None of these are actually observed in biological science. Okay, for example, let's look at embryonically the same way. Here's a development of a human hand and a frog hand or foot. They all sort of start out with this kind of stump, and in the human development, the material is dissolved or removed between the digits. In the frog foot, the material grows out or is added. So they develop in quite the same structure, develops in quite different ways. If we look at developing from the same embryonic tissue, in sharks, the alimentary canal is formed from the roof of the embryonic gut, and in frogs, it's from the roof and the floor of the embryonic gut. And in birds and reptiles, it's from a lower layer of the embryonic disc. Or if we look at the forelimbs of newts, they're formed from the trunk segments 2 to 5, lizards from trunk segments 6 to 9, and humans from trunk segments to 13 and 18. So that's not true either. If we look at them being controlled by the same gene sequence, in mice, the gene that controls eye color also controls physical size. But in fruit flies, the gene that controls eye color controls the female sex organ morphology. And in mice, the same gene that controls eye development produces a mammalian eye, and in flies, it produces a multifaceted eye. So that doesn't hold true either. So the assumptions behind morphology as being indicative of evolutionary passing down just don't stand up to real operational science. And it's recognized in some cases as well that there is a problem. And that is that in some cases, particularly the eye, the most recent alleged common ancestor of two different organisms didn't have a corresponding part from which these could be derived by evolutionary differentiation. Eye being a particular example of that. So they say, well, okay, homology doesn't work here, so instead it's homoplasy. That's when you get correspondence between parts or organs acquired as a result of parallel evolution or convergence. So it doesn't matter really what the evidence is, it's evolution is the answer. And these kinds of eyes, incidentally, these kind of human eyes, have apparently evolved separately over 60 different times. Okay, so that brings this whole idea of homology as being an indicator of evolutionary ancestry into question. Now let's look specifically at this dinosaurs to birds. This is what you would typically see in a museum or a display. I think this is from the one in Chicago, where they show Archaeopteryx as a transitional form between dinosaurs and birds. And certainly we've got lots of really nice fossils about Archaeopteryx. They think it's a transitional form because of homology. It has both bird-like and reptile-like features. For example, it has wing claws, which are considered reptilian, but it has nice full flight feathers, which are birds. Well, there's also this bird in South America, which has wing claws, fully developed bird that has wing claws, particularly when it's young. It's an arboreal bird. It runs around in the tops of trees. So these wing claws are quite useful to keep them from falling out of it. Here's a picture of one. And if you were to draw the Archaeopteryx in the same sort of perspective as a Hoatzin, they sure look a lot alike. Ostriches also have wing claws. See? Pictures of them. And so this idea that Archaeopteryx is a transitional form is in some dispute even within the evolutionary community. Dr. Alan Fiducia, who is a recognized expert on bird history, has demonstrated that these claws on Archaeopteryx are just like those of modern tree-living birds, and quite unlike either terrestrial birds or theropod dinosaurs. So he says that, and he additionally highlights 9 other features of Archaeopteryx that make it look like a modern bird. And he says paleontologists have tried to turn Archaeopteryx into an earthbound feathered dinosaur, but it's not. It's a bird, a perching bird, and no amount of paleobabble is going to change that. So according to this expert, that's not a transitional form, and what we actually have is dinosaurs and birds, different kinds of things. Now this diagram, again, is labeled here on top of the fossil column. It says it's a succession of life, but if you think about it, it looks like what you would expect from critters being buried as a result of rising floodwater during the flood. You get the little bottom-dwelling ocean creatures that can't move around very quickly would get buried first by the turbidity currents, and creatures that could run around on land and get away from the rising water would be buried further up, and that's exactly what we see. In that case, this would only be 4,500 years ago, in which case the radiocarbon that we see in dinosaur bones would be realistic. The soft tissue that we see in dinosaur bones would also be realistic. So again, this interpretation is perfectly consistent with the evidence that we actually see. The University of California at Berkeley says about Steno that he noticed that of the 2 major rock types in the mountains near Florence, the lower layers had no fossils, just what we saw, while the upper ones were rich in fossils. He suggested that the upper layers were formed in the flood, after the creation of life, while the lower ones had formed before life had existed. This was the first use of geology to try to distinguish different time periods in the Earth's history. And it would seem he's got it right, until Hutton came along, imposed a new interpretive framework, and changed it all up.